In DataGuard, there are few important terms that you should know. These terms are apart from the components and apart from all the configurations that you do in DataGuard. Of course, we'll be looking them in practical, but before even looking them in practical, you should know these terms. It's like only introduction to these terms. The first term that is mostly used in DataGuard is failover and also the switchover. Both the terms you will hear frequently whenever you are in an environment. They'll always, I mean, all the DBAs will always talk about failover, switchover. But what exactly is failover and switchover? In simple terms, failover is activating the standby database when there is a natural disaster. You have a production site, you have a DR site, there is natural disaster on the production site and all the application users are diverted from the production server to the standby site. This is known as failover. Naturally, automatically pushing the clients from production site to the DR site. A failover is said to happen when there is a real disaster. You cannot call a failover just for the testing purpose. Like you're testing, okay, can I switch clients from production to the DR? That is not a failover. That is called as switchover. That is the second term. Basically, failover is when there is a real disaster and clients are shifted from production server to the DR server and you activate the DR server as primary. Remember I talked about the role changes. If your primary database, if your standby database is activated and changed into primary database, that is when you call it as activating of the standby database. In a failover, your standby database is activated and all the clients are diverted from the production server to the standby server. That is failover. Next is switchover. If there is no natural disaster and you want to just test whether you can really trust your standby database and you can shift your clients from production to the standby database when a natural disaster will occur, that is known as switchover. As a DBA, when you manually perform the role changes of the databases, like you convert the primary database to standby and standby database to primary, this is known as switchover. That is activating the standby database manually. These two terms are very important and in every database interview you will encounter this question like what is the difference between failover and switchover. Once again, failover is nothing but activating the standby database when there is a real natural disaster. Switchover is activating the standby database manually, maybe for the testing purpose. When we are into failover and switchover, basically we can't see failover because it has to be a natural disaster, but we'll definitely be performing a switchover. And in switchover, we'll confirm, okay, if our standby is good or not, and can we trust our standby when there is a natural disaster. We will be looking at switchover in our later concepts while we are troubleshooting the DataGuard. The next important term that we have in DataGuard is in sync. You will hear this term pretty frequently. In sync simply means that your standby database is exactly same as your production database. One question, how do I define whether my standby is exactly same as my production database or the primary database? Simple. We know that logs are shipped from primary to standby. So if the logs that are generated on the primary and the logs that are applied on the standby both are same, it means my primary and standby both are in sync. If there is a gap or if there is a difference between the archive log numbers, for example, on primary the log number is 10, but the archive log which is applied onto the standby is 7, we have a gap of 3 logs. That is the next important term in DataGuard. Now what is a gap? Archives are generated on production and not being applied on the DR. There might be different reasons. We'll get into the reasons and configurations later, but for now understand the terms. In sync simply means that both your primary and standby log sequences are exactly same. When the log sequence are not same and there is a difference between the log sequences on your primary and standby, it is known as gap. Let us look at once again all these terms. We have a production server, we have our standby, or we can call it primary and standby. If there is a natural disaster, the clients which are connected to primary are shifted from primary to standby. This is known as failover. And remember, whenever your clients are shifted to standby, the role will change. Let's take our standby is physical standby, which means it will be in mount state. This role will be changed from physical standby to primary, and the database mode will be open, nothing but read write mode. This is called as role change. If there is no role change, then your clients will not be able to query the standby because your standby is in mount state, and in mount state you cannot run any query inside the database. In a failover, your primary database is completely gone and your standby database is activated by changing the role from physical standby to primary and opening the DB. This is the general failover. Let us look at switchover. In a switchover, you still have primary, you did not lose your primary, and you have a physical standby or maybe any type of standby. This is your primary and you have standby. Now you want to test whether your standby will help you when there is a natural disaster. What you can do is you can perform a switchover. A switchover is nothing but I would like to shift my clients from primary to standby and also switch the roles, which means my primary will be converted to standby, and initially it is in open mode, it will be changed to mount. My standby will be converted to primary, and initially it was in mount state, it will be converted to open. Now if you look at this configuration, this is nothing but a same data guard configuration in a reverse order. This is your primary, this is your standby. Your log shipping service will work in opposite direction because your logs will be generated at your new primary. Now these logs are to be shipped from your new primary to your new standby because your old primary has become now a standby database, and there is a log apply service which will apply all the logs that come from the new primary to your new standby. This is nothing but called as switchover. So switchover is a manual intervention where a DBA will try to shift the database roles and also try to check whether your standbys will help you in a natural disaster or not. Any which ways, we will be performing a switchover when we are into the switchover topic, but for now this is the definition of failover and switchover. Failover is when a natural disaster happens on primary and your standby is activated. Switchover is a DBA who is trying to check whether the standby will support in a natural disaster or not. When you call your DR is in sync. Simple. We know that on prod logs will be generated, and on your standby these logs which are coming from production will be applied. See, there is a difference between shipping and apply. When all the logs which are generated at the production are applied on the DR, then we call it as DR is in sync. Now when all the archives or all the logs that are generated on the production, they are shipped, they are at the DR, or maybe they are not shipped because log shipping service was not working, and they are not at all applied onto the DR, then we call it as DR is having gap. Now this is the difference between DR being in sync and DR having a gap. Now there are multiple reasons for the gap. The simplest way to identify a gap is we have two services, log shipping service and log apply service. If something went wrong with your log apply service, there will be a gap. If something happened to your log shipping service, there will be a gap. Or if both the services fail, definitely there will be a gap. Or there might be some other reasons, but these are the two basic reasons. But if both of them are working perfectly fine, then you will have to troubleshoot further to find the reason for the gap. So these are the DataGuard important terms which you must know, and in every DBA interview, your interviewer will definitely ask you these four terms, and you must know the in-depth details of these terms.